Good morning, dear colleagues. I can see that people started joining after the reminder. So let's give them 2 more minutes and then we will start. Good morning once again, dear colleagues. Let's start. We would like to welcome you to our regular webinar on the statistical framework to measure corruption, which was drafted by the UNODC and recommended for all of the countries, the members of UNCAC. My name is Azal Juldasovic. I'm the National Coordinator for the Anti-Corruption Program in the Regional Office of the UNODC in Afghanistan, Central Asia, Iran, and Pakistan. Our webinar is held on the basis of the Central Asia Platform for the Fast Tracking of UNCAC. We have the simultaneous interpretation provided from English into Russian. You can select the language you need in the bottom menu. Today, we will need your smartphones with the cameras because we will have some interactive questions and you will have to scan the QR codes to provide the answer to the question. I hope it would be interesting for you as an exercise. Today, we have the regional representative of the UNODC, Dr. Oliver Stolpe, and the head of the Informational Analytical Center of our regional office, Ms. Salome. And we will speak about a number of questions today related to the efficiency of the anti-corruption mechanisms in the elections, prevention of the corruption in private sector, in public authorities, and also the measures on anti-corruption education and training for the public servants. And I would like to ask the first question. I guess I will address it to Dr. Stolpe. Based on your experience, what do you think? What is needed to be done? How can we ensure the conditions so the anti-corruption education for the public servants would be efficient and will not become a routine as a formality?
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Assad. It's a great pleasure joining you today. It's an interesting question. And in preparation for this webinar, I sort of like really tried to ask myself how we, as the United Nations, being often actually a provider of such training initiatives or working in tandem with our member states in developing specific courses, whether it's at the international level, at the regional level, or at the individual country level. And of course, these questions are also pertinent to ourselves. Now, one of the things that I think makes this question of particular interest at this specific moment to the region is, of course, the fact that many countries have actually or are in the process of introducing very specific legislation aimed at enhancing, so to speak, the integrity of public officials and, of course, the integrity of service delivery as a whole. And one of the specific things that comes to mind is, of course, the recent approach towards the introduction of either laws or standards of conduct, which are specifically addressing the less obvious parts of, I'm careful to hesitating a little bit to call it corruption as such, but of conflict of interest situations. Because the issue, of course, of conflict of interest is that it is intrinsic to all ourselves that we are working in the public sector, and that includes myself as well. It is a constant, essentially, feature of our work that our private interest may in some way start to conflicting with our public office. And on the one hand, it requires ourselves a great level of sensitivity and sensitization as individual professionals to learn of how to identify those things, how to be cautious, how to ask the questions not once you have crossed the red line, but possibly before. And of course, always to look at the issue of conflict of interest, not only whether I am giving in and acting as a along the conflict of interest. So I'm acting upon the conflict of interest, but to ask ourselves, could I be perceived, could my actions be perceived as a conflict of interest? And I think that's really the litmus test. And to train people, especially to train public officials in large numbers, because this is really a situation, while it might be most pertinent, I guess, for public officials in managerial positions, public officials that have to do with the management of the finances of the state, like, for example, procurement officials. At the end of the day, it really applies essentially to all public officials in some way and form. And designing training programs that are actually giving us that sensitization is absolutely critical. It's not only critical to make sure that public officials are aware and do act with the necessary sensitivity. It is also critical because in cases that we come actually to the conclusion that a conflict of interest was not appropriately managed, was not appropriately reported, and the persons involved, the public officials involved, did not, for example, withdraw from the specific procedure where the conflict of interest essentially arose, that in those cases disciplinary measures may be required. So we want to be sure not only that we train our public officials appropriately, but also that we are sure that they have the necessary knowledge so that we can hold them to account when they are violating these kind of conflict of interest regulations. So in that sense, training programs are critical to create that necessary awareness. And I think now we're coming to the question of how do we measure actually their impact? Now, obviously, here, I think most of us are engaging in 3 levels of measurement. And the truth is, in most cases, I think we can be honest with ourselves that we are measuring often only the first level. So what are the 3 levels? The first one is basically just simply a sort of expression of appreciation. Essentially, did you like the training kind of questionnaires, which are obviously very often administered at the end of a training? We sometimes a little bit disrespectfully refer to them as happy sheets. And very often I have to admit that in those kind of like questionnaires, issues such as, for example, the quality of the food that was given as part of the whatever the training package often influences the appreciation of the trainee more than maybe the content of the delivery. And that's of course very sad, and that of course in itself already tells us of how relatively imperfect those kind of like assessments are, but they still have their value and they are important because, of course, especially when we're talking about adult training, it is very important of whether our clients, our trainees, actually appreciate the training, found it interesting, found it stimulating, found the presenters, well prepared, but also engaging in their deliberations. And as such, we want to, of course, make sure that we deliver on that expectation. But then there's, of course, the next step, which is really the question, are we actually increasing knowledge and skills of the trainees? And here, I think the next step, so that's the second level, what we really need to have is essentially a pre-training assessment and a post-training assessment that gives us a true measure of the extent to which knowledge and skills have been improved. And that, of course, should in those cases go together with a real certification kind of process. So we want to make sure that just as we do it for our children in school, that they're not just being rewarded for their efforts, but that they're being rewarded for actual improvement against whatever the benchmark is. So in this case, I think, for example, adjudicating appropriately conflict of interest situations and being able to outline the appropriate steps that should be taken in a specific case scenario. That could be ways of essentially determining to what extent has the training been effective. And then there's the last one, and that's typically where I think the absolute majority of training schools, whether they're national training academies, whether they're international providers of training, such as the UN, is often are failing, is the question of a post training assessment, where you essentially go back to the trainee after maybe 6 months, 3 months to 6 months, and you check essentially to what extent the training has been actually relevant, and try to find out whether specific impact was achieved by the trainees because of their participation in the training. So that third level we are often ignoring. We are trying ourselves at the regional office for Central Asia to get better at that with regular inquiries with our clients. That's many of you yourselves, in trying to assess the impact. I think there's also sometimes some barriers that we are encountering in that context, because it's a new approach. Many public officials are not allowed to just simply express their opinions to an international organization such as ourselves with regard to the quality of the training, the relevance of the training that we delivered, which is unfortunate. Obviously something that gradually needs to be addressed. And we're working towards that. But this is sort of like a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. And then I wanted to give one last example where I think we have really actually ticked most of the boxes in terms of like creating an effective training tool. And that is a very specific kind of public official, namely judicial officers. So as you might be aware, or at least some of you, there is a specific international code of conduct, a set of principles that guide judges' behavior, that are developed around basic judicial values such as impartiality, equality, independence, integrity. And these kind of values have given birth to something that is called the Bangalore Principles. Now, these principles were developed by chief justices from around the world some 20 plus years ago, 25 years almost ago. And those principles have then given birth to these Bangalore standards of conduct. And they come together with a commentary, and more recently, they come now together also with a 3-session online training, which is a certificated training. So I can strongly recommend to those of you who are working presently with your ministries of justice or your Supreme Courts about this specific question of training judges on ethical conduct, to actually look at that training. It exists already in Russian language, so at least it should be accessible for the judicial profession in the region. And of course, we would be happy to also explore the possibilities of developing that training into the local Central Asian languages. But I think for now, the important part is the training is there. It is easily accessible. You register. Takes you about 5 hours to go through all the 3 modules. Each module comes with a lot of case studies, scenarios where the trainee constantly has actually to interact with the training program. It's fully online, fully an e-learning tool. And then at the very end of the 5 to 6 hours training, there is actually a test. And once the test has been completed successfully, then you obtain a certificate. So one very easy way of actually making sure that your judges have the basic knowledge about the ethical standards to which they should aspire to and comply with is to oblige them to undertake this training as a mandatory training and to submit then the certificate about successful completion to their human resource entity, whoever that is. Could be in some cases the Supreme Court, could be in some cases the Ministry of Justice, could be in some cases the High Council of the Judiciary, whichever the entity is, and that essentially keeps the personal files on all the judges, should be responsible for the collection of these kind of like certificates. So that's just a few sort of like generic thoughts, as well as maybe a specific hint towards a type of training. And of course, we are ourselves starting to think about the specific the challenge of developing a conflict of interest training with the Uzbek civil service. So maybe it would be also interesting to hear in the course of this seminar on what our Uzbek partners are thinking in that regard, and what are their views on how to make this training most effective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stolpe. Indeed, the relevancy of the training programs is very important, significant, and the feedback mechanism is crucial in these cases, especially mechanisms which prove the significance of the knowledge and skills which were obtained throughout the training course. The educational issue is always important, and we already received a question which is not that simple, I guess. Maybe we will be able to answer it in the end of the webinar, and we need to give some time to our participants so they would think about the question and then suggest what they think. But briefly, the question is as follows: what should be done for the anti-corruption education so it would not be used by the anti-corruption authorities to actually commit corruption-related violations or offenses? I guess this is a very interesting point of view. We have something to think about. But for now, let's follow the course of the webinar. I would like to remind you that the webinars are available on YouTube channel of UNODC. This is the webinar number 6. Those who are joining us for the first time, please find the rest of the webinar series on this YouTube channel to understand what was mentioned previously. Those who would like to refresh the knowledge, you can also look through the previous webinars. At the end, we will also provide certificates. Today, we have the last session. So next week, we will meet once again, and those who are interested in getting certificates and taking the final test, please share your emails with our colleagues, Gulnar Kudaybirgenova and Zafar Abdullayev. Please, Gulnar and Zafar, share your emails in the chat box for the convenience of our participants, so they would contact you. And now, colleagues, please use your smartphones, scan the QR code, and let's have an interactive survey. Please just use your camera, scan the QR code, and then you will get the access to the menu. Gulnar, please start the survey and then the demonstration of the results. The first question is quite simple. Is the perception of corruption the direct indicator of corruption or an indirect indicator based on the lectures we had previously? I think you will be able to answer correctly. I guess 100% replied correctly. This is an indirect indicator. Next question, please. What types of corruption are included into the statistical framework to measure corruption? So what we are reviewing today as well: bribery, power abuse, money laundering, extortion, bribery, and C, bribery, power abuse, and nepotism. We have different options, actually. Participants answered differently. B was the correct answer. So not all of the indicators could be measured easily. So the statistical framework is also limited to some extent. And within the framework, we are looking at the issues related to the bribery, extortion, and money laundering. And the question number 3. Who should be a part of the measurement of corruption at the national level? A, international organizations, civil society, academia. B, presidential administration, Senate, anti-corruption bodies. And C, national anti-corruption agencies, prosecutor's office, the financial investigation units, and national statistical services. Statistics. A couple of questions more, please, so we would understand what you are thinking about this question. C was the correct answer. It covers all the possible categories of the stakeholders. Let's continue. Coming to the main part of the webinar here, I would like to hand over to Ms. Salome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Asad. Good morning, dear participants. Very nice to see you again in this 6th webinar. Today, we're going to review very quickly 4 topics in the statistical framework to measure corruption. In this slide, you can see that we are highlighting the topics today. And also, I want to clarify, we are not going to review each one of the indicators in each one of these topics. We selected just a few to give you a flavor of what you can find. And actually, we also included some additional references for you to dig deeper or learn about tools, about trainings that are available and that would help you to further understand the complexities of implementing measures to prevent corruption. So all the topics today are under the category of preventive measures. The first one has to do with elections. The second and third indicators that we will review today are connected to preventive measures in the private sector and in state-owned companies. And then we will end up with the training programs. Regarding, I think Oliver already mentioned about the training programs, the challenges that we face when conducting training on corruption. There was this very interesting question already about the trainings. And I just would like to say that when we had the consultation to put together this statistical framework, we were not thinking about including any indicator on the training on corruption, because as we already discussed, it's very difficult to really have a good indication of how effective these anti-corruption trainings are. But all of the countries participating during the consultation phase were pushing very hard for us to include indicators on trainings, because when we were actually reviewing the existing anti-corruption strategies in many countries, all of them have had a strong component on training. So that's why we had this topic included in the statistical framework. But again, very challenging to really have good indicators to measure the effectiveness of this training. So let's start with the first topic. So this is about measuring corruption in elections. Article 7 of the convention asked countries to implement measures to enhance transparency in the funding for candidates and for the financing of elections. So the indicators that we included here are basically to monitor expenditures versus the funds allocated in both cases. And of course, this is very important to monitor, because usually elections in many countries are a hotspot for corruption, and they can, of course, give advantages to specific candidates or specific political parties. And that's not the worst part. The worst part comes after, when these candidates or political parties are elected, and then because they receive money from third parties, they have to actually act not on the best interest, but on the interest of those that actually provided funds for their campaign. So this is a huge risk. And in some countries, they are already monitoring this kind of expenditures. Well, first the regulations and then the expenditures. Thank you for going to the next slide. Actually, in this slide, you can see that we have 11 indicators under this topic. This is one of the few topics in the statistical framework in which we have all types of indicators. So we have direct measures, we have perception, we have risk indicators, on both sides, indicators that actually allow us to see what are the opportunities to commit corruption. This is anonymous donations, as you can see there. Then we have risk indicators to monitor constraints. This is if governments are implementing measures to prevent corrupted practices to occur. And then we also have indicators under the response category, both in terms of regulation and in terms of the response from the government institutions. So let's go to the first indicator, very simple. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is, as I was saying before, to track, to monitor the total campaign spending per candidate versus or divided by the total campaign funds allocated per candidate. The disaggregated disaggregation suggestions are to have this information by candidate and by sex, and by region and state, to see if there is any trend there, either by sex or by geographical area. And yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. And of course, the challenge is always to have this information systematically collected and to have this information available there. And in many cases, we see that in most of the countries, this kind of well, first of all, this kind of allocation and these kinds of expenditure are not really reported. So the challenge is the underreporting from both the candidates and the parties. The next indicator is pretty much the same, but it's like I was saying at the beginning, it's about the spending by political parties for funding their campaigns. And it's also to monitor to what extent there is transparency in the allocation of these funds. I think we face the same challenges, so there's not really, we don't need to further elaborate on this indicator. Then we have a direct measure of, thank you, I think that we are in indicator B6.3, and this is about perception. I mean, I think this is about prevalence. And I see that in the Russian version, the formula is missing. But I think we have discussed the perception indicators before in these webinars. And this is just basically one of those indicators that we can obtain from surveys, from population surveys usually. But of course, we can also get this information from polls, maybe, to understand how many people in society thinks that there is corruption during elections. In this case, I think I'm really getting confused here between the Russian and the English, because in my English, I see the prevalence of vote buying. So again, this is a direct measure of corruption, and this is to understand how many people experience vote buying during elections. So this is how many people were asked to vote for a specific party during an election in exchange for some little money or a gift or something else. We have, as we have seen in other webinars, a UNODC manual to measure corruption. I think I've shown it in the first webinar when we were talking about the prevalence of bribery, the experience regarding corruption. We have this manual, and I am talking about this manual now because this manual includes questionnaires for countries to measure the experiences of corruption, in particular 3 types of corruption. So in this manual, we include questions to measure the prevalence of bribery in their interactions between citizens and institutions, mainly to obtain public services of licenses or specific permits. So this is experience of bribery. We also have the experience of nepotism, and we also have questions to measure this specific type of corruption, which is vote buying. So in case anyone is interested, We have already some questions for the measurement of vote buying, which is the way how corruption occurs during elections. And I see you are jumping already to indicator 6.5. We are skipping here the one on perception because I think we don't need to elaborate. We have seen enough about perception indicators and the advantages and disadvantages of perception indicators. And I think in regards to elections, we don't see many countries really measuring the perception of corruption in the context of elections. So we are skipping that one for now. But in here, we have the indicator that is on the risks. And we see that anonymous transactions, anonymous donations is also a big risk because anonymous donations is also a way for bad actors to influence politics without leaving a trace. So again, very challenging indicators in terms of data, because in order to be able to measure the percentage of anonymous donations to political campaigns, we need to have solid data on donations, and we need to have solid data on the individuals doing these donations, because we see that in many cases, if the donations come from companies, there is a risk of using shell companies or front organizations that may hide who are the real donors behind these anonymous donations. So in some countries, we see some rules to avoid anonymous donations. In some countries, we see that there's not the rules, but there is actually not even a proper monitoring of these anonymous donations. So the next indicator, I think we can move on to B.6. This is another indicator about constraints for corruption during elections. And this is just a binary indicator to see whether or not there is an autonomous electoral body that it has enough resources in terms of staff, in terms of financial resources, and in terms of regulations and procedures to actually monitor not only financial records, but also the way that elections are organized. So if there is an autonomous electoral body, most likely that is properly funded and properly equipped, most likely that's going to be a constraint for corruption to occur during election times. There is another risk indicator, the next one, please, that is very similar, and this is the actual existence of the regulatory body to monitor the financing in political campaign and electoral processes. So very much connected to the previous one. With this, I think we can move on to the legal ones, right, Asad? I think this is your turn. Over to you.
Thank you, Salome. Indeed, we are moving to the de jure indicators. And here I would like to remind you that in connection to the previous indicators, the logics and the stage of assessing the legislation is that we are looking first at the risks, then we assess the legislation, whether it's relevant to the risks identified, and the next stage is the actual use of legislation, how the legislation is implemented and how it impacts on the risks. And in summary, we have the general picture of the situation in a certain segment. This indicator, and we're looking at two indicators at one slide. First, the measures of regulation to prevent corruption in the election process and the relevant punishment, and the next, measures of regulations with regards to the funding of the political parties. Another important element I would like to draw attention to: in our region, we use the anti-corruption screening of the regulatory acts, and here it would be very useful to apply these methods because they provide some logics as a basis, as a foundation. These indicators are considered within the Article 7, Part 2 and 4 on the private sector, where we look at the availability of the criteria towards the candidates and elections at the public positions, and also we examine whether the systems are strengthened to ensure transparency and prevent the conflict of interest. These categories would be included as a recommendation in the context of this indicator. So what is related to the indicator 6.6, the institutional independence of the election commissions? Here we need to use the anti-corruption screening to understand whether the election commission or the authorized body is actually independent and can address the issue of the pressure from the private corporations, for example, or the executive bodies. And the next element, another category, what we need to pay attention to in the context of the balance, the tools of the parliament control and public scrutiny to understand whether the parliament has this function, how these functions are implemented. Is there any reporting system where the election commission is reporting to the parliament? What is the process of hearing, listening to these reports made by the election commission? Availability of the mechanism to file complaints, any legal assistance, legal protection. Is there any liability provided for in the legislation in case of buying the votes? And what should be done to monitor such kinds of violations? And also availability of mechanisms to detect and intercept the conflict of interest, the declaration of assets, the beneficiary ownership of the candidates. So these elements play a crucial role in understanding how candidates act in this political space and how they will be doing in future. Another indicator, the funding of political parties. The risks were mentioned today already. Here we need to look at the legislation to understand to what extent the issue of funding and transparency on funding is regulated in the legislation in terms of the political parties. We understand the success of political parties mainly depend on the frequency they appear in the media, for example, and this of course is costly, and the political parties naturally need support from their electorate, and these are not always the voters who fund the political parties, and they do that because of their pure wish to ensure the efficiency of the public sector. They may have their own vested interest. That's why we need to ensure the transparency of the funding sources for the political parties. This transparency insurance mechanism, is it effective? Is it regulated? This is the subject of measurement within this indicator. Here we also look at such indicators as limitation of spending, for example, for the political parties to ensure certain balance, to show this in the media as well? Is there a mechanism to compare the funds allocated and the expenses, where this was a sensible amount, for example, the mechanisms of control and audit in terms of the general public, and what are the sanctions? What is the enforcement? Is there a sanction in terms of over exceeding the limitations to fund the political party? So generally speaking, the analysis of the de jure element is very important, and it informs us about the legislation which may be a reason of failure in ensuring the protection of the electoral process from corruption, or, for example, what elements are not efficient enough. And the success stories, they are also very important, because based on them, we can think about the tools which are applicable in other sectors. So the analysis of your own practice is a very important element. And here we can move to the de facto measurement. Over to you, Salome.
Thank you, Asad. Well, in this slide, we have the last two indicators in this topic. This is the percentage of public officials who were sanctioned for failing to disclose required information on campaign public financing. And we have the same indicator, but not for public officials, but the percentage of candidates who failed in disclosing this required information based on the rules. This is, as in other topics, highlighting the fact that it's not enough to have rules, but to actually enforce them. And if officials working in the political parties or in the electoral body and candidates have information and they are not disclosing it properly, then they must face sanctions. In here, we are suggesting to have disaggregations by sex, by party, if possible, also to see if there are any trends of specific type of officials, of parties, or gender incurring in these malpractices. There are challenges, of course, as in other topics, but maybe the message here is if there is a high number of officials or candidates that are being sanctioned, then that means that perhaps monitoring is good, rules are good, and there are many, and enforcement is good. But it's also an indication that many people are actually breaking the rules. But in a way, I think it's good to measure this, to make sure that there is transparency in financing in campaigns, in political campaigns. And these two indicators can show to what extent the whole system is working, and if really the rules and the transparency is actually enforced, and if it's not, then if the system is working in terms of sanctions. So we have two final slides on this topic. We can move on to the next one. Well, we can infer that if there is a gap between the funds that are allocated and the funds that are spent, if their expenditure exceeds the allocation, then that means that perhaps candidates or parties are getting money from sources that are not really clear, and that's a red flag, a risk, and that should be monitored. And also, if there is a perception in a high percentage regarding the corruption in election process, then that's also signaling that there is a lack of trust in the electoral system in general. In practice, we see two examples of countries that are actually collecting information and disclosing this information. In Brazil, we have the Superior Electoral Court. In this slide, I included 3 indicators from 2022, from the elections in 2022. They actually collect and publish the data during election time. So you can see there, for example, that in Brazil, they had that 6% of the total expending of political campaigns went to social media ads. And because these ads are easily monitored, then that allows to the electoral court to have real-time transaction monitoring. So this is super interesting just to see also, to also measure to what extent using social media ads is effective, and even if it can give more value for money. They also have some indicators about anonymous donations. So in 2015, they banned anonymous donations, but in 2022 election, even if anonymous donations were banned, based on the data that they had, they were able to identify that 12% of the funds that political parties received came from unknown sources. Again, a red flag there. And then they also have a good example of the de facto indicators, because 5% of the candidates were fined for violating the rules about disclosing financial information. We found another example in Germany about some rules for corporate donations, and how they are, by setting up rules, they are limiting the influence of the private sector of corporations during elections. There is a rule that if donations exceed 10,000 euros, then they must be reported. If donations exceed 50,000 euros, then they have to report it to the president of the parliament, and they have to actually disclose the information, not only about the amount, but they also have to have full disclosures about who are the donors, the company, and even personal details of those that are behind the donation. Well, of course, respecting privacy rules as well. So yeah, this is pretty much everything about this topic. Now we can move on to the 2 topics about preventive measures in the private sector and then in state-owned companies. So the preventive measures for, in the private sectors are also under UNCAC Article 12. And in here, basically, the convention asks the private sector to implement specific standards to prevent corruption in the private sector. There are specific mandates in terms of auditing, in terms of accounting standards, in terms of internal controls, and also in terms of preventive measures coming from promoting a culture of integrity within the public sector. I mean, within the private sector, because as we know, corruption is not just a problem in the public sector. There are many corrupted practices in the private sector as well, that can have a huge impact in the markets, in public finances as well because of tax evasion, and other malpractices coming from the private sector as well. So in here, we can move on to the next slide. We have 9 indicators. We have the one on perception, to what extent the private sector it's corrupted. We're not going to review that one. And then we have 2 indicators on the constraints. The first one is about how many enterprises that are medium or large have a compliance or integrity unit or some sort of regime. We find that in some countries they have like a chief compliance officer, and that also can be reported there. We also have another indicator that is the existence of checks and balances, which means policies or processes that are aimed to detect and prevent corruption risks or irregularities. Then we have 3 de jure indicators, and then 3 de facto indicators that are basically related to sanctions and irregularities that are reported to the authorities. So let's go to the first indicator that has to do with these regimes or of compliance or integrity units. And this is basically how a proportion of compliance regimes that exist. So what is the percentage of companies that do have such compliance units or integrity units? And in this one, I just would like to mention, we can go to the next slide. It's the same indicator, but just to give you some elements about what are we talking about when we talk about a solid compliance unit. So in here, again, like in other cases, the need is to have a good system in place to promote this culture of integrity when doing business, to have a good system in place to report malpractices, to investigate and address these malpractices or unethical behavior, to have a unit that is independent enough and that is equipped enough to actually do this work, and also a unit that has the knowledge and the capacity to conduct risk assessments and to actually propose mitigation measure to address those risks that were spotted in the first place. And in this topic as well, I also would like to use this opportunity to do some advertisement. We can move on to the next one. UNODC has been working for a long time in promoting integrity in the business sector. And actually in this slide, we have 2 tools. On the left-hand side, we see a publication that is relatively new. You can use the QR code to scan the publication and to download it. This was published jointly by UNODC, by OECD, and the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact. And basically, it has many chapters to explore how to improve the measures to prevent or to promote integrity in the business sector. And on the right-hand side, we also have an e-learning course that was launched recently, and it's also about doing business with integrity. Unfortunately, this training course is open and is available for everybody, but unfortunately at the time it's only available in English, but I'm sure that colleagues in Vienna are already working to do the translation and actually have this course available in Russian language in the near future. So these are 2 tools that you can actually use to further improve your knowledge on some strategies to prevent corruption from occurring in the private sector. So I think, Asad, you have 2 slides under the jure indicators, right?
I guess there is only 1 slide, which is the next one.
Okay, so I'm happy to go to that one. It's just for the sake of time, we can skip to the examples. I included here examples in South Korea and in Latvia, how 2 institutions there already have some data that is connected to the indicators in the statistical framework. So in South Korea, they already use artificial intelligence to monitor transactions. This is transactions between companies and the private sector. And this is from the top 50 firms in Korea that they started doing these transactions since 2021. They do it on a regular basis, and it's actually available online for everybody to see the data and actually use it for many purposes, not only monitoring the risks of corruption. They also have another example, and we didn't go into this indicator, that is indicator B.7.6, but this indicator is to have public officials not working for the private sector for a certain period of time. We call them cooling off periods. Usually the practice is to have public officials, let's say, staying out of having jobs in the private sector for 2 years. And in Korea, they report an 87% compliance rate in 2023 of public officials waiting for 2 years before joining one of those big conglomerates that exist in Korea, in South Korea. And then the final one is an example of the sanctions that are imposed to people working in the private sector companies, and that were sanctioned because of manipulating procedures related to public procurement. Then on the right-hand side, we have examples from Latvia. The first one about perception. So they do a perception survey to understand which sectors are perceived as the most corrupted in the private sector. And in here, they see that the construction sector is the one that is perceived as the most corrupted. Then they have another example of the indicators on the risk, and they report a compliance in the registers of companies that are used as intermediaries when registering to actually bid in public procurement. So there are good practices out there to monitor the level of transparency and compliance that are measures, important measures to prevent corruption in the private sector. I think we can move on to the next topic very quickly, which is yes.
So sorry.
Oh, you can go to
there is
the
my slide.
Okay,
yes.
sorry, we got it mixed up. Over to you.
Yes.
So, colleagues, going back to the de jure measurement in terms of the business integrity, this is a very comprehensive part. Salome already mentioned how integrity in business impacts on corruption levels in public and private sector. Here we're looking at the legislation in the context of not only Article 12 on the private sector or 21 on bribery in private sector, but also there is a combination of Article 22, 23 on money laundering, for example, and also 26, the liability responsibility of the legal entities. Also, there is a connection to the article number 7 about the public sector. When speaking about the compliance, we start with the availability of legislation on compliance. Looking at the corporate legislation of our countries, very often we can say that the availability of the institutions or the units for the internal control, the compliance units, this is provided for the joint stock companies, for example. But there is another category of companies, smaller in size. In some jurisdictions, it is called the LLC, for example, or LTD, and depending on the complexity of the corporate management, there are different levels of the compliance control, but being prone to the corruption risks, sometimes companies ignore the exposure to risks. This requires an approach to counteract corruption. So we need to check whether there is a requirement in legislation to cover various types, categories of the legal entities, so they would comply with the anti-corruption norms? Is compliance mandatory for various categories of legal entities? Also, the compliance control norms, are they specific? Is there a set of tools which would be used within the institution, the code of conduct, for example, the corruption prevention policy, the internal control or audit mechanism, channels to report on violations, training, and also the due diligence of the counter agents. We also need to speak about the responsibility of the legal entities. If we limit the liability only in terms of the owners, the founders, then the beneficiaries, they are beyond of control. And it's not clear the founder, what role do the founder play? For example, as the executive director, or whether the person was appointed in a way so we could understand that they would like to find the profit using different ways or only legal ways. Because if you hold responsible only the executive director, this may mean that the actual beneficiaries, the founders, they are not held liable. So within the legislation, we need to assess the availability of the legal provisions. And another element we need to look at, to what extent the reporting and monitoring mechanisms streamlined in terms of the compliance units. Another indicator, the regulatory framework on using intermediaries for money laundering. In this case, we speak about the lawyers, accountants, consulting companies, those who could use their professional duties to make it possible to commit corruption-related crimes. And then we need to find an answer. Was it done deliberately or because they didn't know something? So we need to assess the legislation to understand whether the provisions are covering the situations of the intermediaries being involved in corruption, what categories are there, what are the responsibilities of these professions in terms of taking measures to prevent corruption. For example, know your client procedure, know your partner, or reporting about suspicious transactions, which is a mandatory standard for the financial sector, but not always in the industrial sector, for example. Also, licensing for the certain occupations, professions, and monitoring over ethical standards to be there. And also limitations for the former public servants. Is there any constraint? Why? Because the former public servants, very often, they may have influence remained even after they left the public sector. They may have some insider knowledge which could be used to make profit because they have this information. For certain positions, there could be restraints provided for in the legislation, so the cooling off period. We need to just check the legislation and understand, are there any limitations in this context? What is the period of the constraint or limitation, a year or two, depending on the position level of the former public servant? What are the mechanisms to inform about this transition to the private sector? And how the monitoring is done and who is held liable? Ultimately, we get a comprehensive list of regulatory acts, if they are in place, which provide great results to ensure business integrity. If we see that some of the elements are not there, then we can make a decision to regulate certain relations following the convention. And in this context, the products which are developed by the UNODC, they were mentioned by Salome previously, they would play a crucial role here because these materials provide a lot of information and experience in comparison to ISO 37001. So please pay attention to this great advantage of this knowledge, that these practices, they are free, so you can start using them, applying them independently. We will be more than happy to help and assist if needed. And I guess here I would hand over to Salome, and we will move to the next indicator.
Thank you, Asad. Now we have 4 indicators, and this is to monitor the preventive measures for state-owned enterprises. And as you know, state-owned enterprises are a combination of private sector, public sector, and because of this mix, they are especially vulnerable to corruption because of their size of their budget, and the role that they play in a country. There are very specific challenges in terms of accountability, integrity, transparency, and very importantly, efficiency. So there's a lot of work already done by other organizations, and that's why for this topic in particular, we only have 4 indicators: one on perception, a second one on audits, then the existence of the regulatory framework, and then finally the disclosure and transparency requirements as per the OECD guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. We had a discussion with OECD about how it was key to actually link the efforts that they are already promoting in a number of countries in to promote transparency and oversight in state-owned companies, and how having the work that they already have included in the statistical framework to measure corruption that UNODC is promoting, because we think that actually there is a number in the presentation there. I think we can move to one of the slides, but what I was going to say is that these tools, OECD has been working on this for a long time with the state-owned companies, and they actually did some research about to what extent the risks of corruption in state-owned companies can be mitigated by actually following all these requirements for transparency and disclosure. So, and the percentage is quite high. I think I will show it later. So the whole point of having these guidelines included here is to really make some noise or bigger noise around the importance of transparency and oversight in this a specific, let's say, mixed sector. So I'm just going to go into 2 indicators here. I mean, in the audits, this is the typical indicator that we've seen before. So this is the number of internal and external audits that are performed, especially in those processes that are more vulnerable to corruption, that are high risk. And this is just to see to what extent these high risk processes are monitored, and we are suggesting some disaggregations. This is by type of audit, by sector, and by the actual state-owned enterprise. Then, and with this, I will move on to these OECD guidelines. So the guidelines were published a while ago, and they actually have new iterations of the guidelines. They have, they're very comprehensive. We can move on to the next slide, please. Oh, we are facing the same issue. Okay, over to you, Asad.
Indeed, the development of the training program is a very dynamic process. That's why there are some changes in the slides. But going back to the SOEs, what do we need to pay attention to? First of all, the legal status and the institutional autonomy. It's important to understand that there are various categories of the various forms for the for the companies with the state share. For example, these are the companies which were established by the public company, and they fully belong to the state, to the government, but the activity is not that transparent and accountable in terms of the society. Why not? Because this is the property of the state which belongs to the entire society, actually. And there could be internal control structures. There are joint stock companies which may fully belong to the state, to the government, and they are run in accordance with the corporate legislation in contrast to the SOEs, or, for example, JSCs with the greater share of which belongs to the government, maybe 50%. So the percentage may vary depending on the country, but we need to understand that each and every company with the state share or with the state as the founder should be under certain control. How should we analyze the legislation? It is related to how systematically we ensure the proper control over the activity of the company with the state share. And the great methodological foundation here is the OECD rules, which could be used to assess the legislation. I will speak only about the certain elements, the legal status, for example. In the context of getting funds and subsidies, the SOEs very often they're protected from the bankruptcy because they are using the state budget, and this provokes the risks related to the non-efficiency of management, financial management. And if in case of the private sector, the lack of efficiency may lead to the insolvency, we cannot see this in the public sector. That is why the risk threshold is lower here in terms of the management efficiency of such enterprises. Another element, the SOEs or the companies with the state share should they follow the rules of transparency in the public procurement? Are these rules similar with the rest of the SOEs, or they have some specific regulation? As I mentioned, because of this connection to the lower risks of responsibility for certain losses and damage in the public sector, regulation of the corporate procurement in the company with the state share is of great significance, and we need to pay attention whether the principles of competition, openness in the bidding, is there monitoring of the risks related to the conflict of interest, and many other issues which would be checked in the procurement of the public authorities. We also need to pay attention to the financial supervision over the activities of the SOE. And these are not only the internal control tools, for example, financial control by the Ministry of Finance, or other bodies responsible for the audit, and also accessibility of the results of the audit in the SOEs, whether this is publicly accessible. And finally, the liability, whether they complied or did not comply with the rules. The next indicator, information disclosure. I touched upon it partially when speaking about the indicator 8.3. So we need to analyze in detail to what extent the legislation provides for the clear rules to ensure access to information about the financial performance of the SOEs, and do they comply with the deadlines, the timeline to disclose information for the joint stock companies. For example, there is the deadline for the audits, for the publication of the reports. The General Assembly meeting, for example, for many SOEs, such standards are not in place, and stakeholders, they are actually all of the citizens. That's why we need to be attentive in terms of looking at the extent of responsibility of the SOE to ensure transparency of their activities. If it's not ensured, then we will face big problems in terms of the efficiency of the public sector. This is all about the de jure measurement, and we may move to the next indicators. Halime, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I don't remember if we actually display the QR code of the OECD guidelines. But well, anyway, if we did not, we can share. These are just two examples about transparency. Well, first in Norway, the measurement of perception in the different sectors. And we can see here that only 11% of corruption perceived energy in state-owned enterprises. This is in 2023 versus 34% in the telecom industry. And actually, I think this is somehow connected to the next indicator that reads that 92% of compliance, that these companies, these SOEs, have a 92% compliance with OECD guidelines on a quarterly basis, because they actually follow all the suggestions in terms of disclosures and of public assets. So there's also the other example of indicator from Malaysia. And this is how internal audits can detect irregularities in procurement processes, and also how external audits were actually able to reduce overpayment for a considerable amount of money to more than 200 million US dollars. So I think with this, we can finish this topic. Maybe we can jump very quickly to training, which is V9. Maybe we can skip the next 2 slides, because otherwise, yeah, we can skip this. Maybe if we have time, we come back at the end to this.
Я боюсь, что у нас время очень ограничено, и нашему переводчику тяжело успевать за нашей динамичной лекцией. Действительно, можем остановиться вкратце на юридической оценке по показателю, связанному с оценкой тренинговых программ. Здесь, в общем-то, на что мы должны обратить внимание. Если я не ошибаюсь, это, по-моему, следующий слайд. Гульнар, пожалуйста, смотрите. Следующий.
That's okay. I think we can, yeah, we can jump to this.
Да.
In the training programs, we had 2 indicators. This is the first one. This is the proportion of public officials that complete anti-corruption training programs. And then the other indicator was the jure indicator that was just to have a compulsory training on anti-corruption programs in the public sector. I think we already had some exchange about how valuable it is to measure number of trainings conducted, how valuable it is to measure the proportion of public officials that were trained on anti-corruption. I think the challenge here is more like to see how effective are these trainings. I saw a question earlier about the risks even of misusing this training for the benefit of public officials. And I also want to recall what Oliver was saying at the beginning. He said that in case of training, maybe we need to do a pre-assessment and a post-assessment to really understand if the training was effective, at least in terms of understanding the concepts, understanding the expected behavior. I think that's one way to see or to assess whether or not training was effective. But we can actually be more ambitious. And even if we didn't include the indicator here, I mean, even if we only have as a suggested indicator to measure the proportion of public officials that were trained on corruption in a given year, this is great. We can have this indicator available, but it would be even more valuable to have this indicator in combination with, for example, the number of sanctions that occurred. Okay, so what I'm saying is, for example, if in the judiciary, they have that 100% of public officials working in the judiciary receive training on ethics and conflict of interest and integrity, and then we see that in the judiciary, there are many officials that are investigated because of corruption practices in a specific area, then we can see that there is a clear correlation that this training might not necessarily is not necessarily effective. So there is some value there of monitoring, yes, the proportion of public officials that are receiving this training, but then if we see this indicator in relation to maybe sanctions or in relation to investigations, then we can have a sense of whether or not this training is actually effective. I think I want to end here because I hear that we have to respect the time of the interpreter. So with this, I would end, and over to you, Asad. Thank you to everybody, and especially the interpreter, because she's fantastic.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues. I will just briefly explain the next slide. So when we went through the statistical indicators on the training, we could pay attention to the legal foundation of these figures. At least here we need to look at the legal obligations. So where this training should be arranged in the educational institutions, or this would be the training program within a certain institution, for example, how do we assess the knowledge received? Is this a just assessment tool? And whether this educational training is mandatory or voluntary. And then ultimately we will understand what is the impact of the training on the corruption. I guess this is the it. We need to finish the webinar for today. I am very sorry. Maybe we will try to take your answers briefly. Bogdan, you had a very interesting question on how we can prevent the use of the anti-corruption tools for the corruption purposes, actually. There should be in each anti-corruption agency the mechanism for the internal control. And this includes the tools to regulate the ethical norms. So if you have the due internal control, the ethical norms which are regulated, and the mechanism to control the risks of the conflict of interest, you will be able to minimize the risks when the highly qualified specialists use their knowledge and skills not for the benefit, but against the public good. Zamira, you asked a question about the way we can apply political will. This is a very complicated question, actually. I guess we need to speak about it next time on our next webinar to avoid this vague discussion today. I can see another comment in the chat box. It's quite extensive and I'm afraid we do not have enough time. So let's us discuss it next time on our next webinar. But I would also like to take 2-3 minutes of your time. Maybe some of our participants, do you have any question which could be very brief and we would respond to complete today's session? If any questions, I will give you the floor for 5 seconds. Please raise your hand so we would know that you have a question or a comment. I guess no questions. Colleagues, once again, thank you so much for your participation, for staying, bearing with us. The webinar will be available on our channel. I think in 3-4 days it will be posted. So please do check our YouTube channel to refresh your knowledge, watching the previous webinars, and this could be very beneficial for you in future. Thank you once again and see you next time. Bye-bye.